Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 28 of the Take Your Shot podcast. Of course, as always, I'm your wonderful host, Joshua Gitman. Again, I want to thank you all for listening to that Mario Chalmers interview we had last week. That was absolutely incredible. But now it's time to get right back into business as there are only about 20 games left for each team in the regular season. So we're going to dive right into the playoff races, dive into the playoff scenario, see what each team wants, what's the ideal seed in each conference. We're going to dive into that with 20 games to go. And we're going to start with the East and then move our way to the West. We've got four major seeding races from the top of the East to the middle of the East and top of the West to the middle of the West. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Let's start with the number 2 seed in the Eastern Conference. That race, we've got the Milwaukee Bucks and the Cleveland Cavaliers. Bucks currently at that 2 spot, 41 and 22, and they've played pretty well. They've won 6 straight coming out of the All-Star break. And then you've got a half a game behind them at 40 and 22. You've got the Cleveland Cavaliers, who did have that pretty hot stretch, lost a few games here and there, had that nice win against Boston coming back from 20 the other day, where Dean Wade had that absolutely incredible fourth quarter. So Cleveland's not too far behind there. And that 2-3 spot right there is a race for the 2 seed and a race for home court advantage in the second round, probably against one another, unless somehow Miami or New York drop to the 6 or the 7 and upset one of those teams in the first round of the playoffs. But let's start with Milwaukee here. Milwaukee, as I said after the All-Star break, they've had an absolutely incredible 6-game winning streak until the other night against Golden State when they lost by 35, if I'm not mistaken. No, 25, 120 to 95. If I'm not mistaken, that was the final score. But Milwaukee has been playing a lot better lately, other than that game. Doc Rivers has really gotten this team up to speed. Their defense, ever since the All-Star break, has been number one in the NBA. They were a few games behind Cleveland, but now they've picked up the slack, and they are sitting at 41 and 22. They are 8 games behind Boston, but they are in a comfortable spot in the East where they can guarantee themselves home court, and they have separation from Orlando, New York, Miami, as they're 4 games ahead of Orlando, if I'm not mistaken, at 37-26. We'll get into that category of the Eastern Conference a little later. But Milwaukee has been playing pretty well, and I think if they can keep it up, I think, if I'm not mistaken, they have the tiebreaker over Cleveland. So I think so if they do end up tying, I think Milwaukee gets that. I think it is important to have home court in that second round, even though Cleveland may not get there. If you're the Milwaukee, you still want that 2 seed. For one, you do get home court in the second round. But for another reason, you also get to play a play-in team, whether that's potentially Philadelphia or Indiana, or if it's Miami or New York, but probably Philadelphia or Indiana, who Indiana's had a little bit of a drop off since the All-Star break, and Philadelphia has not been healthy. And by playing those play-in teams, the play-in teams that are going into the playoffs are not going to get the same amount of rest as, say, the 6 seed when playing the 3 seed, which is important when you're the 2 seed, factoring that in, because those first 2 games, you're probably going to have a rest advantage there. So that gets you off to a fast track in the series. But as I said, Milwaukee has been playing really, really well. It's still, of course, in the Eastern Conference, Boston against everybody else. Boston, 48 and 13, 8 games ahead of Milwaukee. Clearly, probably in a few more games, is going to clinch the number 1 seed. But Boston has been absolutely dominating the East. And still, most people, when they're looking at Boston versus the field, they would probably take Boston. But right now, the biggest threat to Boston is Milwaukee. And I understand Milwaukee has had a lot of issues. They've had a lot of problems this season. But when you've got Giannis Antetokounmpo and Damian Lillard at the helm of the floor, that's a very, very scary team and a very, very scary offense. They still got to fix a lot of stuff. Their offense is still a little bit shaky. Their chemistry is still a little bit off. But I did like the move from Doc Rivers adding Jay Crowder to the starting lineup. I think he brings a lot of veteran experience on that front edge rather than other players such as putting Pat Connaughton in there. I think for right now, since Chris Middleton's out, I think the Jay Crowder move, especially for the defensive side of the ball, because Jay Crowder, we know he can shoot threes, but he's a very underrated defender. We saw with him for a while. whether that was in Utah, Boston, Miami. We've seen his defense. So he's a very underrated defender. But again, the key for Milwaukee, the key for them is Chris Middleton staying healthy. If Chris Middleton can stay healthy, this Milwaukee Bucks team is a big threat to Boston. I'm not going to say they're going to beat Boston. Everybody would still have Boston as a favorite in that series, but they would be a major threat to Boston and their title hopes. And pretty much ever since Middleton's had those knee issues past 2021 when they won the championship, he's had those knee issues, and it's just been a lingering problem for the Milwaukee Bucks for the past 3 years. Whether that's because he's sitting out on back-to-backs and just not playing consistently enough to integrate with that team this year. And also, by sitting out in the regular season, Middleton's causing the Milwaukee Bucks to drop down seed lines, which ultimately is important because remember, for example, I'll give you 2022, they were the 3 seed when Boston was the 2 seed. So even though they were up 3-2, they had the chance to close out in Milwaukee in Game 6, and they didn't. That crucial Game 7 was in Boston. So it's important for Chris Middleton to stay healthy. This is the only way this team has a shot at the title and a shot at dethroning what looks like a historic Boston Celtics team. But if the Milwaukee Bucks can stay healthy, they can absolutely be there. And I think the 2 seed for them, having home court advantage, having the rest advantage, and playing one of those playing teams, could be a Philadelphia, could be an Indiana, maybe potentially a Chicago or Atlanta if they get on a hot run. I think I think the 2 seed, if I had to choose between Milwaukee and Cleveland, who the 2 seed is more important to, I would probably say the Milwaukee Bucks. But now let's move on to Cleveland. Cleveland's a little bit more of an interesting team because we know Milwaukee has the playoff experience because we saw Milwaukee win the title in 2021. We know what Dame could do in the playoffs. But last year, Cleveland lost in 5 to a New York Knicks team that pretty much lost in the second round. Even though, give credit to the New York Knicks for dominating the Cavaliers, but the Cavaliers absolutely got smacked, losing 2 games on their home floor against the New York Knicks, losing 2 games in Madison Square Garden as well in that playoff series. So it was an absolute disaster for Cleveland, and it's hard to trust them considering we saw them last year. Even though they're a young team, they've barely had any playoff experience. You saw what happened last year, and it just really takes a toll on how you view them going into this postseason, how you see them actually having a shot at winning a round or two. Because again, I've mentioned this in previous shows, but if Cleveland gets the matchup of the Knicks or the Heat, I would probably go with New York and Miami, and probably Vegas would probably have the Knicks and the Heat as favorites in that series. So that would be a very, very interesting 3-6 3-6 matchup for Cleveland, or potentially a 2-7. But why you say Milwaukee needs the 2 seed more, I think because Milwaukee needs all the rest advantage they can get. I think no matter what, I think Cleveland is at a disadvantage in the playoffs. I think people in the Eastern Conference don't really fear Cleveland as much as they play Milwaukee. So I don't think it matters what position Cleveland's in, what team Cleveland's playing, because I don't think teams fear the Cavs as much as the Milwaukee Bucks. We know the Cavs are out for vengeance, and we probably know they want to see the New York Knicks in the playoffs, but we just really can't trust the Cavs, even though they did get the acquisition of Max Strus, who's been good at times. He's been up and down on his 3-point shot this season, but at times in the fourth quarter, he's played really good for Cleveland. And Georges Niang hasn't been too bad, but Cleveland hasn't really been healthy all season yet. They're still the 3 seed, so we really haven't seen them at their full strength most of the time. But when they've been winning, it's not been at full strength for Cleveland, which is interesting. When you go into the offseason, if Cleveland has another first-round loss, do you break up that big man duo of Allen and Mobley? Do you trade one of them? That'll be an interesting thing to look at as well. And speaking of that, Mobley, if I'm not mistaken, is going to be out for significant more time because he's injured. So let's see how this Cleveland team does with Jared Allen at the helm, Mobley not being there, a different approach to the starting lineup. And then also the undrafted rookie Kevin Porter Jr. has also really contributed to this Cleveland Cavaliers benches and has really gave them a scoring boost and a scoring spark off the bench. And they really did find an undrafted gem there with Kevin Porter Jr. Okoro hasn't really played super consistent for Cleveland, but I mean, he's getting the job done. Levert's up and down. He'll give you a good scoring game. It's an interesting team. It's an interesting dynamic for Cleveland because we don't know what's going to happen because we have to take in consideration what happened last year. But at the same point, they're playing so well this year just like they did. But they did the same thing last year and they still lost, but they're still playing really, really well. And it's very, very hard to just disregard this Cleveland team, especially last night when they came back from 20 against the number one team in the NBA, Boston. So it's really hard to count out this Cleveland team. It's going to be an interesting race down the stretch for Milwaukee and Cleveland. Ultimately, if I had to predict who would get the number 2 seed, I would have to take the Milwaukee Bucks. By the way they've been playing, Doc Rivers has got them a lot better, but don't doubt Bickerstaff and the Cavs. They can still win a lot of games. They're capable of winning games. If I'm not mistaken, they still have a matchup with the Bucks left to go in the season, so that may be crucial there. But I'm probably going to lean toward Milwaukee. I think it's more important if Milwaukee gets the seed. Cleveland has been playing really well, but it's hard to trust them. But it's going to be an interesting thing down the stretch. Can Milwaukee maintain their success they've had so far, or are they going to fall off another defensive cliff? Are they going to be that inferior defensive team we've seen all season, or has Doc Rivers found something in this Milwaukee Bucks defense? Time will tell with that, but it's going to be very interesting down the road for Milwaukee and especially Cleveland, considering with how they did last year in the playoffs. But let's move on to a major race in the Eastern Conference, a five-way race, 3 spots in the playoffs, 2 spots in the play-in, 4 through 8 in the East. We've got all separated by only 2.5 games here. We've got the Magic 37-26, the Knicks at 36-26, the Sixers at 35-27, the Heat also at 35-27, and the Indiana Pacers at 35-29. This is an absolute five-head monster. Right now, Orlando has been playing really well. They have a really easy schedule going down the stretch, and they're on a 5-game winning streak, if I'm not mistaken. But they've really beaten up on some bad teams. Not really impressive wins there. I don't want to discredit Orlando because they've absolutely been balling out. They've won 8 out of their last 10. But they've really had a relatively easy schedule. I think their schedule picks up a little bit here. I think they play New York coming up. They play Indy, so it's going to ramp up a little bit. But looking at the Magic schedule, they're definitely going to have an advantage going down the stretch as they have one of the easiest schedules in the NBA there. And then you've got New York here, who is just not healthy. You've got Mitchell Robinson. He's been out an extended time. We know Julius Randle has just really not given any updates when he's going to come back. He was considering surgery, which if you're a Knicks fan, that's scary considering how good this team has been assembled by Leon Rose. You've got OG Anunoby at the trade deadline. Who we don't know when he's going to come back. Hopefully soon. Everybody says it's going to be soon, but he has not stepped on the court. Brunson's been in and out with knee issues. And then they've got, as I said, going back, they've got OG Anunoby at the trade deadline. They've got Bogdanovich. They've got Burks. They've given up young pieces like R.J. Barrett, Emmanuel Quickly, Quentin Grimes. They've given those pieces up to get older, more experienced veteran players who've had the playoff experience to help them contend in the Eastern Conference and potentially win a title. But it's really hard to judge this team right now because they're not healthy. They've lost 7 out of their last 10, but they're still hanging in there tight at the 5 seed. If Miami lost today to Dallas, but if Miami would have won, if I'm not mistaken, New York would have dropped to the 6 seed. Oh, never mind. They would have been tied because New York has a tiebreaker 2-0 against Miami. But it's just really hard to judge the New York Knicks. Let's see if they can keep the ship afloat. They've got a big game against the Magic coming up, so that game's probably going to determine for who's going to be the 4 seed at the current moment. Obviously, we've got a long way to go, but Orlando, I believe, has 3 wins against the Knicks, and no matter what happens in that game, we'll have the tiebreaker over the New York Knicks. Then we've got Miami at the 6th seed. They've been playing a lot better, even though they just got a loss to Dallas tonight. They do have also, like Orlando, an easy schedule going down the stretch, third easiest, if I'm not mistaken. It's very interesting because it's that time for Miami. They're ramping up towards the postseason. They're ramping up towards the playoffs. And they've played absolutely well. Terry Rozier has gotten to where Miami wants to see him. That's who they traded for, Terry Terry has been putting up numbers. Duncan Robinson has really been contributing. We know Jimmy Butler ramps it up in this time. Bam Adebayo having an amazing season there with Miami. Tyler Hero and Kevin Love are currently out with extended injuries, and we just don't know what Tyler Hero is going to do in the playoffs because the last time we've seen him is 2020, like fully healthy for the full playoff run was 2020 when he was a rookie. So Tyler Hero is probably going to be an X factor for Miami. Does he help the team? Does he hinder the team? Because the question has to be asked because last year when Tyler Hero went out, I'm not saying it may have not benefited the Heat by having him, but all of a sudden the Heat went on this run as the 8th seed. Not saying it was all him why Miami went on the run, but you've got to keep that into consideration. So Hero is going to be an interesting X factor going in for Miami in the playoffs, and Miami ramps it up, and they've got an easy schedule, so it'll be interesting that race between Orlando, New York, and Miami there because New York is falling down. They're not healthy. Let's see what they could start getting healthier. They could start winning more games again, but right now they're not healthy. So Miami's probably going to start winning a little bit more games. So that race for that 4 seed is going to be interesting with those three. Then talking about Philadelphia as the 7th seed, they're tied with Miami currently at 35 and 27, but Miami has the 2-0 advantage against Philadelphia with 2 more games to go, so Philly could still tie that season series up. But Philadelphia, we know Joel Embiid has been out for a long period of time, so it's going to be rough for Philadelphia. They've really had to try to keep the ship afloat. They did win 2 games in a row at one point. They had impressive wins against Dallas and I'm trying to think here. The Hornets. Hornets are not really impressive, but they did have an impressive win on the road against Dallas. And all of a sudden, Tuesday they lose to Brooklyn, which is a little disappointing. Then all of a sudden Wednesday you have an opportunity against Memphis, who hasn't been really healthy themselves all season at home, and then you blow that game too when you had a big lead. So it's been a rough 2 games for Philadelphia. They've got a couple of hard games coming up for Philadelphia. I know they played the Knicks twice in New York. They play the Pelicans, the Bucks. Then they go play Miami. They've got Phoenix, Lakers, Clippers, Kings, Clippers again, Cavs. So this schedule for Philadelphia is not an easy schedule, and it's going to be very hard to keep the ship afloat for Philadelphia, especially with Embiid out. And again, when Embiid does come back, he's got to adjust to Philadelphia's system. This offense now is being relied on Tyrese Maxey. And don't get me wrong, Tyrese Maxey has been absolutely incredible, even though they've lost games. But it's going to be tough to integrate Embiid, and especially since we've got only 20 games toward the playoffs. But Embiid's not going to come back for probably at least another 10 games, probably even more. He may not even come back till like the middle of the first round for the playoffs. We don't know when Embiid's going to come back, and it's going to be rough for them to integrate and run the offense around Embiid when they've had this whole new system set up now for a month or two, revolving the offense around Maxey and Tobias Harris but a more perimeter focused offense for Philadelphia. So it's going to be rough for Embiid to come back in and Philadelphia to integrate him. But it'll be interesting if Philadelphia can keep the ship afloat, especially with the tough schedule. Then you've got Indy at the 8th, sitting at 35 and 29. And Indy's had their ups and downs this year. They're, as most people know, the best offense in the NBA, but their defense is just as bad. They're so bad, like it just completely cancels out the offense. They had a rough loss to Minnesota when they had a decent lead in that game, and they blew that game to Minnesota. The Pacers have a relatively easy schedule for the next couple of weeks. Then it starts to ramp up again for Indiana, but not a really super hard schedule. So if Indiana can figure out their issues, because they have lost a couple of games lately. I think they've lost 4 out of 6, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, they've lost 3 out of 4. They've lost 4 out of 7. Yeah, not 4 out of 6. 4 out of 7 Indiana has lost. So they've been on a little bit of a cold stretch. But you've got Tyrese Halliburton. He's playing a career year. You traded for Siakam, and we've seen what Siakam can do when it gets time to the postseason. They've got a decent roster. I really thought that the Buddy Hield trade hasn't really worked out so far for Indiana. I mean, Doug McDermott, he's playing okay for Indiana, could be a lot better, but hasn't really done a lot for Indiana. And they just pretty much gave up Buddy Hield, who can provide three-point shooting at a very high rate. And I just think they sent him to Philadelphia for nothing, which so far that's not looking good. I mean, Aaron Nesmith has been okay. Miles Turner's had a decent year for Indiana. But this team is above average. But the question is, can they get to the point where they can get out of the play-in and have an interesting matchup in the first round with Cleveland? Because I think if Indiana plays Milwaukee or Boston, even though that Milwaukee matchup would be interesting considering what we've seen from Indiana and Milwaukee this season, from the 50-point game ball to the in-season tournament. We've got a lot of fights and conflicts with those two teams. They've played 5 times this season, and Indiana's won 4 of them, I believe. So that'll be interesting if they play, but I think Indiana really wants to try to avoid playing Milwaukee or Boston. So does everybody in the East, but I think if Indiana has a living shot, I think they're a team that really needs to get to out of the play-in tournament and into the playoffs, getting a matchup with Cleveland, Orlando, or the Knicks if they want any shot at trying to move on. But they've got a team, and their offense, even though we know how bad their defense is, their offense can keep them into games, and that's the new NBA. Sometimes what they say is your best defense is your offense. So if Indiana can have good offense, but try have like their historic offense, I think it might be a tough matchup and a tough out for one of those higher seeds. So you've got that 4 through 8 race there, and I think the teams that really need to stay out of the play-in and try to get those 3 spots in the playoffs are probably Indiana, New York, and Orlando. I think Miami is comfortable going to the play-in. I don't think Miami really cares about going into the play-in. And I think New York, I think Philadelphia, it's been rough for them, but I think Indy, New York, and Orlando really need to stay out of that play-in tournament. I think for New York's perspective, I think it's going to be a tough matchup with Boston or Milwaukee. I think they're comfortable playing Cleveland. I think they're comfortable playing Orlando or Miami or Philadelphia or Indiana, whatever team in the East. But I think the Boston matchup would not really be suitable for the Knicks. I don't think the Knicks match up well against the Bucks when they've got Giannis. I don't really think they have a Giannis stopper. I'm not too high on Julius Randle's defense. I mean, Mitchell Robinson and Hartenstein and Achua could provide some defense there for Giannis, but I don't think it's really going to get there. I mean, Achua's had a really solid season for the Knicks ever since he came over there at the trade deadline from Toronto with OG Anunoby in that trade. But I don't think they really can stop Giannis, and I don't think anybody can stop Boston. So I think New York, if they want a shot, they've got to stay out of there. I think Orlando needs to stay out of there. They're a young team with 0 playoff experience. I think Gary Harris may be the only one with any significant. Oh, and Joe Ingles. Shout out Joe Ingles. Sharpshooter. Have any real playoff experience for that Orlando team. So it's going to be, I think what would be better for Orlando would be to stay out of the play-in and try to play a team that they have a living chance against. I don't think Orlando's going to do anything in the playoffs, even though they've had an incredible season with Paolo Banchero leading the way. I just think it's a young team that's not experienced enough and is not built. I'm not going to say not built for the moment, just not ready for the moment yet. They're young. They're going to grow. And if you're an Orlando fan, the future looks very bright for this franchise. So don't disregard these don't hate on these comments. I just think it's a young team. Like, look at Cleveland last year, as I mentioned. Cleveland, a very young team, even though they had some playoff experience with Mitchell. It just they just bursted at the moment. So I think Orlando, they probably want a favorable matchup. I think New York, if they ended up playing, would be tough. I think Miami would be tough. I think if you're Orlando, you'd probably want to try to play Cleveland, Philadelphia, or Indiana if you want a shot there in the Eastern Conference. But I think it'll be tough for Orlando, so I think it's a necessity for them to stay in the playoffs where they are currently right now, and I think they will probably do that since they have one of the easier schedules left to go in the season. And then also, I think Indiana, I think Indiana does as well because, again, just like Orlando, same reasoning. They're a young team. They don't really have a lot of experience. As I said, Pascal Siakam's had experience, but all of a sudden their just bubble can burst. So I think Indiana needs a favorable matchup. And then, as I said, Miami, not afraid of anybody. Philadelphia does have a Giannis stopper and Embiid. They could make it interesting with Boston. Obviously, I wouldn't pick Philadelphia or Miami in those series, but I don't think those teams are necessarily scared of those teams, and I think they'd be willing to play them, whether that's the first round, second round, or conference finals. It doesn't really matter for those teams. So that's why it's more of a necessity for those three teams. It's going to be very interesting down the stretch because any given moment at time you could drop from being the 4 seed, going on a 2-game losing streak, going all the way down to 8. So every single game for these teams are very, very crucial, and nobody wants to be in the play-in tournament. You get less rest. You have to play more games. You're not guaranteeing yourself in the playoffs, even though we haven't seen a 7 seed falter yet. If you're an 8 seed, you could definitely falter, and the 7 seed, you may not falter, but Miami as a 7 seed last year going into the play-in was pretty close to faltering. So you're not safe. The the essence of it is you're not safe in the play-in tournament, and you have a rest disadvantage going into the first 2 games when you have to play on the road in a playoff series. So I think it's important for all of these teams to treat every game like playoff basketball because it's going to be very, very tight down the stretch. It'll be interesting to see how, if New York gets healthy, if Joel Embiid comes back, how they integrate them. So that'll be a very interesting race going down the stretch there. But let's now talk about the Western Conference. We've got a huge race for the number 1 seed, the West. We've got 4 teams trying to compete there. We've got Minnesota at 44-19 as the 1 seed currently. We've got the Thunder as the 2 seed at 43-19. I believe OKC has the tiebreaker over Minnesota. As for the 3 seed, we've got Denver at 42-20, and we've got at the 4 seed LA Clippers at 40-21. Now, clearly there's 2 teams here that stand out more than the other 2 as actual playoff contenders, but we've got to give a lot of credit to Minnesota, and we've got to give a lot of credit to Oklahoma City. They're very young teams, and they've absolutely balled out, and they deserve to be where they are. But let's first talk about Minnesota here because breaking news, Karl-Anthony Towns left meniscus injury, going to be out for a significant period of time, and according to reports, will probably not be back until early in the playoffs. So he might not even be there at the start of the Timberwolves playoffs run. So that could be very interesting going down the stretch especially in an 8-1 matchup or a 7-2 matchup. That could be very interesting considering the teams in the play-in tournament right now, which we will get into a little bit later. That could be very interesting as Karl-Anthony Towns is a huge factor for that team. That team really needs Karl-Anthony Towns' offense because even though we absolutely adore what Gobert has done for Minnesota on the defensive end this season, they've really helped Minnesota be that number 1 defense in the NBA this year. The offense is just as crucial for Minnesota because at the end of the day, you're going to need to score because players on the other side, when you're playing defense, are going to step up their offense. So Minnesota is going to need to step up their offense, and the only way I believe they can do that is with Karl-Anthony Towns. And if Karl-Anthony Towns is not there, not healthy for this Minnesota team, it's going. Honestly, I would probably pick the opposition in that series, no matter honestly who it is. I don't care if it's Phoenix, Sacramento, Dallas, Golden State, the Lakers. I would probably pick all of those teams against Minnesota if they have Karl-Anthony Towns because he's just that damn important to this Minnesota Timberwolves team and their success. So that's a huge concern for Minnesota going down the stretch. But they've played really, really well. Their defense, as I said, they're number 1 in the league. They just got an impressive win against the Pacers. They're on a 2-game winning streak. They did lose a game to the Clippers, which could be important down the stretch. Minnesota's got a interesting, I wouldn't say super hard, but I wouldn't say super easy also. They've got to play some tough teams. They've got Cleveland, the Lakers, the Clippers still. They've got the Nuggets. They've got Cleveland again. They've got the Nuggets again. They got Golden State. And then at the end, and they've got Denver like a third time. They've got Phoenix twice. They've still got to play a little bit of tough teams down the stretch, but there's also a lot of easy teams in their schedule. So we're really going to find a lot we're really going to find out a lot about this Minnesota team and learn about this Minnesota team and if they're actually legit, because now they're starting to play the contenders in the West. They're starting to play the Denvers of the world, the Phoenixes of the world. They're starting to play teams that they could potentially face in the playoffs, such as the Lakers and the Warriors. So we're really going to find out a lot about Minnesota in these last 5 weeks before the postseason. And I don't know what they're going to do with Karl-Anthony Towns. They've got Naz Reid off the bench, who, in my opinion, he's a very good bench piece and a very good backup big. But the problem is, even though he plays similar to Towns' game, a stretch big who can hit some threes, get in the post a little bit too and dance there, it's just very hard to replace Karl-Anthony Towns' offense. So I don't know. I mean, Naz Reid can help a little bit with that. I don't know if he's necessarily going to start, but he can help a little bit with that. I know they just signed TJ Warren to a 10-day contract. That might seem a little bit like a tiny news, but look out for that. TJ Warren, we know, played amazing in that 2020 bubble for the Indiana Pacers. Really been off a lot of teams' radars. He's been traded a little bit, signed with the Nets for a stretch, but has been a little bit off the radar. But TJ Warren is a capable scorer, so look out for that. That may not be something small there by Minnesota. So that's an interesting move by the Timberwolves, considering the Karl-Anthony Towns injury, trying to get more scoring, trying to get more offense for this Minnesota team. But they've played really well. They're a young team, but again, in the playoffs, even if they did have Karl-Anthony Towns, it would be very interesting to see who they would match up against. Because if they match up against the Golden State or the Lakers, when we know they have two amazing players, and Golden State having Curry, LA having LeBron, that would be a very tough matchup for Minnesota. And again, just like last year, we could see an 8 seed, we could see a 7 seed, we could see multiple 8 seeds and 7 seeds win their playoff matchups and upset top 1 or 2 seeds, especially even though they've played amazing as well. The Oklahoma City Thunder at 43-19, they're a very young team as well, just like Minnesota, and they're actually younger than Minnesota, and they've been more surprising than Minnesota, even though we know Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is an MVP candidate, and he's been absolutely balling out. When you look at the rest of their team on paper, it's not like, wow. I mean, Chet Holmgren's played amazing. They've got Lou Dort, Jalen Williams, Josh Giddey, but really nothing other than that just stands out. I mean, they just traded for Gordon Hayward, but he really hasn't done much for the Thunder team. But other than those 5, really nothing stands out for the Oklahoma City Thunder. So it's just shocking how they've had this surgence this season. Most of it's due to Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Part of it's due to Chet Holmgren absolutely balling out and being my Rookie of the Year. I know some people don't like that, but we'll get into that a little bit more coming up toward the end of the season, talking about award races for one last time before we hit the playoffs. But I do think Chet Holmgren is my Rookie of the Year, because when you're the second best player on a second seed, that's all I got to say. I know Victor's playing amazing, but he's a rookie. He's the second best player on the second seed in the West, potentially the number 1 seed in the Western Conference there. And then Jalen Williams has had an amazing season as well, putting up 18 points per game. Josh Giddey is doing his thing there, and Lou Dort, a very solid, underrated defender. I know they got Isaiah Joe off the bench. They've got they signed Mike Muscala. They're playing Cason Wallace, the other Jalen Williams, the Jaylim Williams. And it's just looking at this roster on paper, it doesn't really stand out. But Oklahoma City is winning games, and they're winning games by a lot of points. They have the biggest point differential in the Western Conference at 7.6, and the second biggest in the NBA behind Boston at 11.2. So the Thunder are not just winning games, they are dominating games. And right now, coming down the stretch, they've won 8 out of their last 10 games. Even though they had a rough game against the Lakers the other day, probably because they were on a back-to-back, they've just been playing winning basketball. And you've got to give props to Mark Danglute as the Thunder coach. Nobody really knowed who Mark Danglute was when he got the job. Still, people like before the season had no idea who Mark Danglute was. But now everybody knows who his name is, what his name is. And he is most likely, in my books at least, and most likely everybody else's books, going to be Coach of the Year. So the Thunder have absolutely been shocking. But again, as I said with Minnesota, they're a young team, anything can happen if they get that matchup against Golden State or LA, even Dallas, or maybe if Phoenix falls off a little bit. Sacramento's an explosive offense. Any of these teams could potentially come up there and beat Oklahoma City, beat Minnesota. So that would be interesting to look at down the stretch. So potentially, maybe if you're Minnesota or Oklahoma City, I would probably prefer the Pelicans or the Kings in the playoffs, but you really can't control that considering how close the race is going in the middle of the Western Conference, which we'll get into in a couple of minutes. But the playoff matchups will be very interesting, and trust me, we will have a special podcast on the playoff matchups before they begin. But now let's move on to the two contenders of these top four, the two teams that most likely people have higher hopes on. And let's start with the defending champions, the Denver Nuggets, the 3 seed, currently at 42-20. They lost 3 straight before the All-Star break. Then now they've won 6 straight before losing their last game to Phoenix on Tuesday in overtime. And now they're currently, as I'm filming this podcast, playing the Boston Celtics, and they're up 8 at halftime, 62-54. And the question we've had for Denver this year coming into the season, they lost Jeff Green to the Rockets. They lost Bruce Brown to the Pacers. Now he's on the Raptors. Where's the bench production coming from? And that bench production has been coming from Reggie Jackson, who's absolutely been incredible as a backup point guard, 10 points per game there. Braun's doing his thing, 7 points per game. Peyton Watson hasn't been half that bad either at 7 points per game. And then there's been just a bunch of fillers, but they do have that solid 8-man rotation going into the postseason with Peyton Watson. Would have liked to see them get one more piece at the trade deadline, but it's really tough considering they're a second apron team and they've given up a lot of their assets. So you really can't ask a lot from them. But Denver right now is looking to most people the favorites in the Western Conference. I still have the Clippers as the favorite, in my opinion, in the Western Conference. But Denver been playing really amazing so far to start after the All-Star break. And if they keep this pace up, they were like 3 games behind Minnesota, Oklahoma City. Now they're only a game behind the Thunder and 1.5 games behind Minnesota. That can shift down a half a game if Denver beats Boston tonight in the Mile High City. But it'll be interesting down the stretch in the playoffs to see the depth of that team. Are they going to because if Denver is concerned about the depth of the team, are they going to overuse their core 5 guys of Jokic, Jamal Murray, Michael Porter Jr., Aaron Gordon, KCP? Are they going to play those guys too much in the early rounds and they may be fatigued later going into the playoffs? That's going to be interesting considering how deep the Western Conference is. And currently right now they're playing Phoenix in the first round, 3-6 matchup. That's no gimme matchup because you've got Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, and Bradley Beal. God forbid they all stay healthy. So that's not a gimme there. So you really can't you're going to have to rely on your depth a little bit. And could they expose the depth? Could a team expose the Peyton Watson matchup? Yes. So it would be interesting to see that going down the stretch for Denver, going into the playoffs for Denver. We'll talk about that when previewing the series, previewing the matchups there. But I think the depth, I think they need one more piece because I think both of those guys, Green and Brown, are huge losses for Denver. And I thought they probably could have gotten maybe someone in the buyout market. But again, it's tough because they're a second apron team. But it's concerning looking at their depth. Like, I understand Peyton Watson's had a decent season, but he's very young, little inexperienced. I know we said the same thing about Christian Brown last year, but this may come back to bite me in the face when Denver wins the title again, and Peyton Watson's averaging 10 points in the finals. But that's my opinion. But Denver's played well. Denver's played mellow. Malone and the boys have done a lot to get themselves back on track. And what was interesting is a story that came out today. The Denver Nuggets were supposed to visit the White House on the 18th of this month for their championship, obviously, because you go to the White House when you win the title, but they're not going to win. They're not going to the White House because the day after, on the 18th, the day after the 19th, the Denver Nuggets are going to play Minnesota, which most people thought that would not be a significant game going down the stretch. But now when you look at the standings, Denver potentially, when they win today, being only a game behind Minnesota, that is going to be an absolutely crucial game for Denver and their hopes of being a 1 seed, because the 1 seed's important. The 1 seed is very important because if you get the 1 seed, that conference runs through your arena, and it's very hard to play in Denver, especially with the altitude. We've seen issues with it. It tires out teams, and Denver has one of the best home court advantages in the NBA. So it's tough when you playing in Denver. So I think that 1 seed race is going to be crucial. But if the Clippers, who are a little bit behind track, stay that 4 seed, maybe the 1 seed might be a little bit of a curse because you'd rather play Minnesota, OKC in the second round rather than the Clippers. But time will tell. But I still think the 1 seed's important when going down a stretch, when playing in the playoffs. Like, home court advantage is important because you've got that critical game 5, and of course you've got game 7 at home. So that was an interesting storyline that came out today. So Denver's focused, Denver's ready, and we'll see what they do down the stretch. And hopeful, and they'll try to get another 1 seed. Now let's go to the Clippers. The Clippers, they've had a little bit of a rough patch lately. They've won. They're 5-10 in their last 10 games. They lost to the Bucks the other night. They had this rough stretch coming out of All-Star break, losing to the Thunder, the Kings, the Lakers. So the Clippers haven't been necessarily perfect, but they were struggling the other night against Houston, down by 20, and they came back in that game. And also Russell Westbrook's going to be out for a significant amount of time for this Clippers team because he has a fractured hand. So that's an interesting storyline. Even though Westbrook's not like the guy anymore, he's still a major piece for that Clippers team coming off the bench. So that could be a potentially big loss for the Los Angeles Clippers there. And when you've got and even though they've struggled a little bit, I still have them as my favorites of the West. When you look at the team, I know they've obviously, you've got Kawhi and Paul George. You've got Harden, who we've seen him in the playoffs. I know Harden in the playoffs, but when he's the third option on this team, I don't think we really need to worry about him taking the shot, because if he's struggling in the playoffs a little bit, you've got two dogs in Kawhi and Paul George to carry the load for that team. You've got Norman Powell off the bench, who can score 30 on any given day. You've got Mason Plumlee, who's played solid off the bench. You've got Zubac, who hasn't really played half that bad either for this Los Angeles Clippers team. And they've got Terrence Mann, who's, again, he can give you 15 any given night as well. So if you're the Clippers, I think you have the most depth in the Western Conference. I think you have the most talented roster on paper in the Western Conference. And I think Tyronn Lue is one of the most underrated coaches and one of the top 3 coaches currently in the NBA. And I think Tyronn Lue really emphasizes that defensive side of the ball. And I really think he can create game plans, create schemes for this team to set them up to succeed. And again, if they get a second round matchup with Minnesota or Oklahoma City Thunder, they will have a clear advantage and be clear favorites in that series to go to the conference finals for the second time in franchise history. And I like how they match up against Denver. You can have Paul George on Jamal Murray, or you could put him on Kevin Porter, or you can put him on Michael Porter Jr. You've got Kawhi. You can put him on Gordon. He's physical. I think Zubac, even though he may not stop Jokic, he's a little bit of an underrated defender. But I think the Clippers' focus, if they were to play Denver, I think would be let Jokic score and just lock down the other guys. And they have guys that can absolutely do that. So if you're the Clippers, I think you're sitting in a good position. I don't think the 1 seed really matters. They don't really have a great fan base anyway, because the Lakers are the kings of Los Angeles. But if the Clippers have those guys healthy down the stretch, if Westbrook gets back healthy, they have those guys. I think they have the most talented roster, and I think they have the depth edge over a team like Denver. And I'm still leaning toward the Clippers of being my favorites in the Western Conference. But they still got a long way to go. They have a little bit of an easier schedule coming up, but it's not going to be perfect, as they have a disadvantage for that 1 seed. It gets a little bit harder in April, but for the rest of March, the Clippers really need to stack up wins, because they've got the Bulls, they've got they've got the Bulls twice, they've got the Hawks, they've got the Blazers twice, they've got Sixers, Pacers, Sixers again, Magic, Hornets. So I think this Clippers team can really start stacking up wins in March. And if they can do that, they can get back on track to potentially be one of those top seeds, even though it may not be a necessity. Still, you like having one of those top seeds. You rather play at home than play on the road. So it will be important for them going down the stretch. But I think that looking at this 1 through 4 race overall, I think it's very crucial for, I think, Minnesota and Oklahoma City to get the 1 and 2 seeds, as they probably need home court advantage the most. But it may cost them to get the 1 and 2 seeds because, as I mentioned, sitting at 9 and 10 teams, the two teams that can only get the 8 seed if the playoffs started today, in Golden State and the Lakers, you don't want to play those teams because, as I said, you got LeBron James, you got Stephen Curry. Nobody wants to play those guys in the playoffs. So it's a little bit of an interesting situation there, 1 through 4. We'll see how the playoff matchups go out. We'll see how the play-in matchups happen, and it'll set up for the West. But we've got to talk about those teams in the middle of the Western Conference. We've got to talk about the Lakers, Warriors. We've got to talk about the Pelicans, the Suns, the Kings, and even the Dallas Mavericks, because this is a monster race going on the stretch. These teams are only separated by 4 games, and anything can happen. Any team can go on a winning streak. And you've got two playoff spots, and you've got 4 play-in spots. And even though the 4 play-in spots, you're in the play-in, it sucks. Those 4 play-in spots are crucial, especially those 7 and 8 spots, because if you're a 7 or 8 seed, you only have to win 1 game compared to the 2 games you have to win when being a number 9 seed or a number 8 seed. So it's important, even if you're probably going to be in the play-in, to get that 7, to get that 8 seed in the Western Conference. But let's start with the number 5 seed, New Orleans, sitting at 37-25, having a 1-game lead over the 6 seed Phoenix, 1.5 games out of the play-in as the 7 seed Sacramento. New Orleans, even though they've had their issues this season, we know all about Zion staying healthy. They've had their fair share of injuries. Brandon Ingram's been out extended periods of times. Even McCollum's been out here or there. The Pelicans are 12 games over 500. And when you look at their core roster with Ingram, CJ McCollum, and Zion, and even Valanciunas you can put in the mix too as being part of their core roster, that's a very scary team going down the stretch. And that's a very defensive, physical team, and that's a team that's going to be very gritty in the playoffs, and they're probably going to wear you down. And that's a team that you would probably not necessarily don't want to see, but it's a team that's going to give you a challenge, a team that's really going to give it your all, give it them all, and they have the roster to potentially pull off an upset. They've got, as I said, they've got the 4 core guys like Herbert Jones, who's had a pretty decent season. Jordan Hawkins is a rookie, providing a little bit of scoring for a Pelicans team that is defensive heavy. They got Alvarado, who's a pest on the defensive side of the ball. They've also got Larry Nance Jr. He's a solid veteran who has finals experience with Cleveland. So this Pelicans team, even though they don't really have that appealing roster, they've been a little bit under the radar in the Western Conference here. 12 games over 500 and sitting in a very comfortable position here. And even though they would play the Clippers today, if they could get another one of those matchups of Oklahoma City, Minnesota, that would be interesting as well. But I think New Orleans does have the team to pull off the upset. I'm not going to say they're going to do it, but that's a very interesting team, and a team that's being very, very undervalued and looking very under the radar this season. Next, we got the 6 seed Phoenix Suns at 36-26, a game behind the Pelicans and a half a game ahead of the Sacramento Kings from the play-in. Phoenix, big storyline this year. Health. All 3 of them have barely played the 4 together. Whether that's Kevin Durant being injured for a little bit, but it's mostly not him. Shout out to Kevin Durant, because KD just plays, just flat out plays. Doesn't matter what's going on. KD just plays. But it's Bradley Beal with the injury problems. Again, the ones we've seen in Washington, they're coming back here in Phoenix, which is going to be a concern for this team in the long term. You've got Devin Booker. He was out for a significant chunk, and now he just injured himself again, and he's going to be out for a little bit as well. So it just, even the Phoenix can never stay healthy, and it's hard to play with a team in the playoffs, like that's fairly new and not familiar. Those big three barely played with each other, not familiar as playing as one core group. So that could be a concern. But yet there's still concern going down the stretch. But yet for Phoenix, they're still 10 games over the 500. They're still in a decent position here and a good position to get the 5 seed or get the 6 seed. But if they get the 6 seed and play Minnesota or OKC, I think they would be in a decent position there going into the Western Conference semis. But we know Phoenix is going to have to dethrone Denver or the Clippers. Could they do it? Yes, they could. They do have the offensive firepower to do it. If those guys play consistent, those guys play well, those guys hit shots, and they get a decent amount of stops. And most importantly, as I said, they stay healthy. They play together consistently. This team is a scary team because they have three dynamic scorers who we know can score the ball at a very elite level. Even though we have concerns about their bench, you never know. Royce O'Neal was a decent pickup for them. David Rodney didn't play that bad at Memphis. We know what Grayson Allen can do. Eric Gordon, we've seen his experience in the playoffs. So it's not a necessarily disaster bench for Phoenix. Like, it's not like they have nobody. But that obviously that's a concern. But at Phoenix, they're still in the radar. They're still in the mix for that Western Conference. I'd probably put them at 5 right now as my teams winning the Western Conference behind those top 4 seeds. But they're still in the mix. They can still pull off some upsets, and if they stay healthy, they could still potentially win the West and even win the NBA title with the talent they have on the roster. Now, the 7th seed Sacramento Kings, they're at 35 and 26. They're a game ahead of Dallas for the 8th seed, half a game behind Phoenix for the 6th seed, 2 games ahead of Golden State and for the 9th seed. So for Sacramento, they've had a decent year. I mean, not as mind blowing, not as noticeable as last year being the 3 seed, and everybody knows Sacramento was not just this bum franchise anymore. Their defense is just absolute. Sacramento's defense is just absolutely brutal. We know what Fox and Sabonis are going to bring. Fox and Sabonis are going to bring offense, 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 offense. Keegan Murray also offense, offense, offense. Here's the problem: your top 3, we don't see any defense. Those top 3, you can't tell me play a decent play decent defense. I know Fox, you could make the argument for, but I think he's a little bit of an overrated defender. I don't think really any of those guys play significant defense for those teams. So I don't really know what to say for Sacramento because they're in a tough spot. Again, they are in that 7 seed position. And if they do get the Oklahoma City Thunder, they do get Minnesota, I probably wouldn't pick them. But again, upset alert. Upset alert could definitely be on there. They do have the playoff experience now. They lost a tough 7-game series last year to Golden State and a series that they had opportunities to win. Still didn't win it, but they played a tough series and they looked pretty good in the playoffs. So you never know with Mike Brown's squad. Again, as we say, offense could potentially be the best defense. They're averaging an astonishing 118 points per game, but giving up 117.8 points per game. So we've seen the Sacramento formula work considering the Western Conference has gotten a lot deeper? I would say no for right now, but you never know depending on the right matchup. But if they do another first round exit, there should be serious consideration about trading some of those young guys like a Davion Mitchell in order to get a player that can help the Sacramento Kings win now, because this is their best team in years and Sacramento needs to take advantage of it before they become poverty once again, because we know it's going to happen. 8th seed Dallas Mavericks. They were on a 3-game losing streak. They just beat Miami tonight. They're a game behind Sacramento, a game ahead of Golden State, game and a half ahead of the Lakers for the 10th seed. Every game's important for Dallas, and I think if Dallas just gets into the playoffs, when you have Luka Doncic, when you have Kyrie Irving, they're a big threat. They have the same problems as Sacramento. They have an incredible offense. Their defense is absolutely atrocious. We saw that last year. We're seeing it this year. The Mavericks do have a relatively easy schedule down the stretch. They still have to play Denver and OKC, but they've got the Pistons and the Bulls. They've got the Jazz twice. They've got the Spurs in there. They've got the Hawks. They got the Warriors, I think, 3 times. They've got the Hornets, the Pistons again. So the Mavericks have opportunities to win games, and I think and every game is important for this Dallas team, considering where you are in the Western Conference. But the problem is defense, defense, defense. Defense wins championships. Defense wins playoff games. At the end of the day, even if Luka has this incredible 40-point triple double, will their defense be enough? And so far, what we've seen from Dallas this season, the answer is no. And when you're looking at a high-powered off, I think Dallas would match up better against a defensive-centric team in Minnesota. But if Dallas were to match up against a high-powered offense team like the Oklahoma City Thunder, I think they'd be screwed. I don't think they can hang with OKC because I think OKC plays better defense with them at the same. They play just as good offense as Dallas, but they play way better defense than Dallas. But if Dallas, it depends on the matchup for Dallas, but most of the time it's not going to be favorable. They could pull off the upset. You never know. You've got Luka Doncic. He's absolutely incredible. But their defense really needs improvement. I thought Lively would be a lot of help for them, would be significant help for them, but he hasn't really been Superman for them. Derek Jones has been okay on the defensive side of the ball. PJ Washington has been a decent acquisition. So is Gafford. Not really anything mind blowing. Even we were overhyping them a little bit to start off, but they have been decent. But like most of their core guys, like Doncic, Kyrie, Tim Hardaway, even PJ Washington, all offensive centric players. So what are you going to do if you're Dallas when you're playing a high-powered offensive team? They don't know, so it's going to be a rough matchup there. So it just depends on the matchup for Dallas, and if they get a good matchup, go into the second round with some momentum. You never know because we've seen this team in the Western Conference Finals, and now they got Kyrie, and they could make a playoff run. But again, matchup, and if they lose in the first round again, there are going to be questions about the defense. Doncic will be frustrated and tensions will start to rise in Dallas, and that will be a very interesting offseason story to track. Number 9 seed, we got the Golden State Warriors. They've been really, really a team that's had a lot of lows, but they've had some highs this season. We know the whole Draymond situation, the whole entire season with that. We know the Jonathan Kuminga situation with Steve Kerr, but things have looked like for Golden State, they've gotten back on track. They've won 7 out of their last 10. They won 11 out of 14 in February. They're now 33-28, only a game behind Dallas and 2 games behind Sacramento for that 8 and 7 respectively. But Jonathan Kuminga for this Golden State Warriors team has been a huge part. I know Klay Thompson has digressed, and because of that, they need somebody to step up. And Kuminga has absolutely done that, even though Klay Thompson has been a little bit better as of recently. It's Kuminga who is the key for this team right now. And obviously, you've got Wiggins, who's also an important factor for this team. He's been out for a while. He's coming back now. Like, I hope Wiggins is doing okay because for the past 2 years, he's been out for long stretches for personal matters. So I hope he's okay. But the Warriors really need Wiggins because clearly in 2022, second best player, in my opinion, on that championship team, could be the second best player on this team if the Warriors want to make a run. So he's very crucial. Pajemski's been playing really well this whole year. Chris Paul, nice guy off the bench. As a veteran, Sarge, Moody can provide a good game here or there. Jackson Davis, not a bad backup center. Peyton's got good defense. Like, this team is capable of making a run. You've got Curry, you've got Kuminga, and still, we haven't even brought up Draymond Green's play on the court. He is very impactful. He impacts winning a lot. So I think this Warriors team has the potential to make a run. Again, if they were to play OKC or Minnesota, you never know. Even if they were to play the Clippers, you never know. Or Denver, I think would be tough for them in the first round. But this team is capable of making one. 3 of their guys have 4 rings. We know what this team can do, and we've seen it. And I wouldn't be surprised if Golden State made a run. And I'm probably, if I had to pick one of the 3 team, if I had to pick 2 of the 4 teams to get out of the play-in tournament, Golden State would probably be one of those teams. And number 10, the Los Angeles Lakers sitting at 34-30. You've got LeBron, you've got AD, you've got the usuals there, Austin Reeves, but this Lakers team is just meh. I mean, Russell's been good sometimes, but the Lakers have basically been overhyped. They're not going to get a Memphis team that's young and doesn't have experience in the playoffs as a 2 seed getting lucky again. They're the 10 seed. They're going to have to win 2 games on the road to get in, and I don't think that's possible. And as a reward, you're playing Minnesota, who I don't think you're going to do well against, especially considering your absolute garbage offense. playing an amazing defensive team, and the Lakers just can't shoot the ball. The Lakers just cannot shoot the ball. So it's a concern for them, and I just don't really see them making a run. And it's going to be interesting for LeBron this offseason. Going to be a very interesting offseason for LeBron. That's all I got to say for this Lakers team. Just been up and down and up and down. They have good wins against the Thunder. Then the next night they stink it up against Sacramento when holding a 20-point lead. Like, you never know what this Lakers team is going to give, and they're not going to get lucky again in the postseason. So if I had to pick a team that's most likely to get out of the play-in between Sacramento, Dallas, Golden State, and the Lakers, I would probably pick the Golden State Warriors to make a run and get out of that play-in. But you could see Dallas make the run too. And if I had to pick two teams, I would say Dallas and Golden State could make the playoffs there in the Western Conference. But though it's very interesting, the dynamic of who matches up against Minnesota and Oklahoma City, because again, I don't want to trash them, but they're just young and they're inexperienced. So you never know. So that's going to be the interesting storyline in the West going down the stretch. But we've got a lot of interesting playoff scenarios down the stretch here for the Western Conference. And I think for right now, we've gone over every single playoff scenario, every single playoff race. And I think for today, that'll do it. So thank you so much for watching the Take Your Shot podcast. And remember to follow on me on Instagram at take_your_shot_podcast_. Again, that's at take_your_shot_podcast_ and tell me how you would have taken your shots on my takes. That's all my shots for the week. See you next time.